This story was sent to me by Marcus Weber via email. The sound of my own breathing echoed in the vault as I realized the heavy steel door had just clicked shut behind me, and the man who had escorted me down here was nowhere to be seen. The emergency button on the wall wasn't responding, and my phone showed no signal 3 floors underground in the Zurich banking district. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I'm Sarah, and back in 2011, I was working as a compliance auditor for international banking regulations. My job was to visit private banks across Europe and ensure they were following proper protocols for client verification and anti-money laundering procedures. It was usually boring paperwork and interviews, but the pay was excellent, and I got to travel. In March 2011, I received an assignment to audit Helvetica Private Wealth Management, a small but prestigious bank in downtown Zurich. The bank specialized in managing assets for ultra-high net worth individuals, the kind of people who kept their wealth very private. When I arrived at their offices on Bahnhofstrasse, I was impressed by the understated elegance, marble floors, mahogany panels, and that particular smell of old money and leather. I was greeted by Hans Mueller, the head of compliance, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and an overly firm handshake. He seemed nervous from the moment I introduced myself, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the elevators. During our initial meeting, he kept steering the conversation away from certain client accounts, claiming they were legacy arrangements that predated current regulations. The first day of my audit went smoothly enough. I reviewed standard documentation and interviewed junior staff members, but I noticed something odd. Several employees would stop talking when I approached, and there were areas of the bank that seemed to be off limits. When I asked about the lower levels, Hans told me they were just storage and mechanical rooms, nothing relevant to my audit. On the second day, things got stranger. I was reviewing client files when I noticed discrepancies in the account numbers. Some files referenced vault numbers that didn't match the standard numbering system. When I questioned Hans about this, his face went pale. He mumbled something about old filing systems and quickly changed the subject, but I had already made note of the vault numbers. That evening, I did some research on Helvetica Private Wealth Management. What I found made my blood run cold. The bank had been investigated in the 1990s for potential connections to laundered money from Eastern European criminal organizations, but the investigation had been quietly dropped. More disturbing were recent news reports about Swiss banks being used to hide assets stolen from developing countries by corrupt officials. The next morning, I arrived early and decided to do some exploring on my own. I used my audit credentials to access the elevator to the lower levels. The basement levels were a maze of corridors lined with safety deposit rooms. Most were standard size, but at the end of one corridor, I found the vault numbers that had appeared in those suspicious files. This is where things went terribly wrong. I was photographing the vault door numbers when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Hans, but he wasn't alone. 2 large men in expensive suits flanked him, and none of them looked happy to see me there. Hans spoke in rapid German to the men, and I caught enough to understand they were discussing what to do with me. One of the men, built like a bodyguard, stepped forward and politely but firmly suggested I accompany them to view the contents of one particular vault. He said it would help me understand why certain information needed to remain confidential. they led us to Vault 2847, one of the numbers I had photographed. Hans entered a complex code, and the heavy door swung open. Inside wasn't the typical safety deposit boxes I expected. Instead, the vault was filled with artwork, sculptures, and artifacts that looked ancient and extremely valuable. But what made my stomach drop were the identification placards I could see on some pieces, indicating they belonged to museums in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. I realized I was looking at stolen cultural artifacts, likely looted during recent conflicts and smuggled into Switzerland. This wasn't just money laundering, this was trafficking in stolen cultural heritage on a massive scale. The bank wasn't just hiding money, they were storing and likely facilitating the sale of priceless artifacts stolen from war zones. That's when Hans quietly stepped out of the vault and I heard the electronic lock engage. The two men had positioned themselves outside and I was trapped inside. With millions of dollars worth of stolen history, I spent what felt like hours in that vault, surrounded by stolen treasures while fighting panic. The air circulation was minimal, and I could feel the oxygen getting thinner. I tried everything, pressing every button, looking for manual overrides, even using artifacts to try to jam the door mechanism. Nothing worked. Finally, after what must have been 3 hours, the door opened, but instead of Hans and his associates, it was Swiss Federal Police. Apparently, my research the night before had triggered some flags in international law enforcement databases. When I didn't return calls from my supervisor that morning, and when investigators noticed unusual activity around Helvetica's accounts, they had moved in. The bank was raided that day, and Hans Mueller, along with 6 other employees, were arrested. The investigation revealed that Helvetica had been operating as a front for an international network trafficking looted artifacts from conflict zones. They would store the items in their secure vaults while arranging private sales to collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance. I testified in the subsequent trial, but what haunts me most isn't the legal proceedings. It's knowing that if those police hadn't shown up when they did, I might have disappeared entirely. Hans later admitted during questioning that they had been planning to move me to a more remote location while they decided how to permanently solve their problem. I never returned to banking compliance work after that experience. I found this on a Reddit thread by user SwissNightmare-2011. The elevator lurched to a stop between floors, and the lights went out. In the darkness, I could hear someone breathing on the other side of the elevator wall, even though the building directory showed this level didn't exist. That's when I realized my late-night visit to retrieve those documents might have been the biggest mistake of my life. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. My name is David, and in 2011, I was working as a junior analyst at Alpenbank Private Services in Geneva. It was my first real job after graduating with a finance degree, and I was eager to prove myself. The bank catered to extremely wealthy clients, many of whom preferred to conduct their business after normal hours for privacy reasons. Alpenbank occupied an entire building on Rue du Rhône, with the main banking floors in the middle levels and executive offices at the top. The building was old, constructed in the 1920s, and had that heavy, oppressive feeling that comes with decades of serious financial dealings. During the day, it buzzed with activity, but after hours, it became eerily quiet. My supervisor, Mrs. Catherine Dubois, was a stern woman in her 40s who had worked at the bank for over 15 years. She handled some of their most sensitive accounts and was known for her discretion and attention to detail. I respected her professionalism, though she always seemed to carry the weight of secrets that went beyond normal banking confidentiality. In April 2011, Mrs. Dubois assigned me to a special project reviewing historical account records for compliance purposes. Some of these accounts dated back decades, and the files were stored in various locations throughout the building. Most of the work was tedious, but I was grateful for the overtime pay and the chance to learn about the bank's more established clients. One evening, while working late on these files, I discovered something troubling. Several accounts showed large deposits that coincided with major political upheavals in various African countries during the 1980s and 1990. The amounts were staggering, often hundreds of millions of dollars, and the deposit dates aligned perfectly with coups, civil wars, and regime changes. What made this even more suspicious was that these accounts all shared similar characteristics. They were opened by individuals using diplomatic passports from countries experiencing the upheavals, but the account holders seemed to disappear from the records shortly after the initial deposits. The money would then be transferred through a complex series of shell companies before ending up in investment portfolios managed by the bank. I should have reported this to Mrs. Dubois immediately, but something about her recent behavior made me hesitate. She had been having hushed phone conversations in French and German, languages she knew I didn't speak fluently. She had also been staying late herself, often working in areas of the building I had never seen her visit before. Instead, I decided to do some additional research on my own. Using the bank's internal database, I traced the shell companies and discovered they were all registered to addresses that didn't exist or were simply empty lots. The investment portfolios were performing suspiciously well, suggesting insider trading or market manipulation. The breakthrough came when I found a reference to files stored on the building's 7th floor. According to the building directory, there was no 7th floor. The elevator only went from the 6th floor to the executive 8th floor. But the file reference was clear, and I had seen Mrs. Dubois using a special key card to access elevator functions I didn't know existed. Late one Thursday night, I decided to investigate. The building was nearly empty, just a few security guards and cleaning staff. I waited until the cleaning crew finished the 6th floor, then used my access card to call the elevator. Once inside, I examined the panel more carefully and noticed a small slot below the standard floor buttons that looked like it might accept a key card. I tried my standard access card, and to my surprise, it worked. A hidden panel slid open, revealing additional floor buttons, including one marked with just a number 7. My heart was racing as I pressed it. The elevator lurched slightly, then began moving upward, but it felt wrong, like it was moving further than it should for just one floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a corridor that looked nothing like the rest of the building. The walls were plain concrete, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly. The air smelled stale and unused. There were no windows, and the silence was oppressive. I followed the corridor until I found a heavy metal door marked with the file numbers I had been looking for. Using my access card again, I was able to enter what appeared to be a document storage room. But these weren't normal banking files. The shelves were filled with what looked like intelligence reports, surveillance photos, and dossiers on political figures from various countries. As I photographed some of the documents with my phone, I began to understand the true scope of what Alpenbank was involved in. They weren't just hiding money for corrupt officials, they were actively participating in political destabilization operations. The bank was working with intelligence agencies and mercenary organizations to fund regime changes, then profiting from the chaos by managing the assets of whoever emerged victorious. That's when I heard the elevator moving. Someone else was coming up to the 7th floor, and there was nowhere for me to hide. I quickly stuffed several of the most damning documents into my jacket and tried to find another way out.
but the floor seemed to have only one entrance. The elevator doors opened, and I could hear footsteps and voices speaking in German. I recognized one of the voices as Mrs. Dubois, but the others were unfamiliar. They were discussing security protocols and mentioning my name specifically. Apparently, the building's access systems had logged my unusual elevator usage, and they had come to investigate. I managed to hide behind some filing cabinets as they entered the document room. Through their conversation, I learned that the 7th floor was known only to a few senior bank officials and their associates in what they called international development operations. Mrs. Dubois was explaining that I had been asking too many questions about the historical accounts and might need to be reassigned to protect the operation. The way she said reassigned made it clear she wasn't talking about a different department. They discussed options for dealing with employees who learned too much, and none of them involved continued employment at the bank. They mentioned other junior employees over the years who had become problems and had to be handled permanently. I waited in that document room for over 2 hours, barely breathing, as they conducted their own security sweep. Finally, I heard them leave, but they had taken the elevator. I was trapped on a floor that didn't officially exist, with evidence of international crimes, and the people responsible knew I was there somewhere. Eventually, I found a maintenance stairway that led back down to the regular floors. I made it out of the building and went straight home, but I knew I couldn't return to work as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I called in sick and used the day to contact Swiss federal investigators and Interpol. The investigation that followed exposed Alpenbank's involvement in facilitating money laundering for dictatorships and funding illegal regime change operations across 3 continents. Mrs. Dubois and 4 other senior officials were arrested, though several others disappeared before warrants could be issued. I was placed in witness protection for 6 months while testifying in various international courts. The most chilling revelation came during the trial, when investigators revealed that 3 other junior employees had disappeared over the past decade after showing too much curiosity about the bank's special accounts. Their bodies were never found, but the consensus was that they had asked the wrong questions to the wrong people. I never returned to banking after that experience. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those voices discussing my reassignment while I hid behind filing cabinets on a floor that wasn't supposed to exist.
This was shared with me on Instagram by Elena Kowalski. I was alone in the client meeting room when I realized the tea they had served me was making me dizzy, and the elderly gentleman across from me was no longer the frail retiree he had appeared to be when he walked in. His eyes were alert and calculating, and I noticed for the first time that the door behind me had locked with an electronic sound I hadn't heard before. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I'm Jennifer, and in 2011, I was working as a private banking relationship manager at Bergman & Associates in Basel. My job was to meet with potential new clients, assess their financial needs, and guide them through our account opening procedures. It was prestigious work, and I prided myself on my ability to make even the most reserved clients feel comfortable discussing their financial situations. Bergman & Associates was known for discretion and personal service. We occupied a converted 19th century mansion near the Rhine with elegant meeting rooms designed to feel more like a gentleman's club than a traditional bank. Our clients valued privacy above all else, and we accommodated requests that larger banks might find unusual. In May 2011, I received a request for a consultation from a Mr. Anton Kozlov, described as a retired businessman from Eastern Europe looking to establish Swiss accounts for his family's investments. These types of inquiries were common, especially from clients in countries with unstable currencies or political situations. Mr. Kozlov scheduled his appointment for late on a Friday afternoon, requesting the last slot of the day for maximum privacy. When he arrived, he appeared to be exactly what I expected. A man in his 70s, slightly stooped, wearing an expensive but outdated suit. He walked with a cane and spoke with a heavy accent that I assumed was Russian or Ukrainian. During our initial conversation, Mr. Kozlov explained that he had built a successful manufacturing business during the transition period after the Soviet collapse. He claimed to have sold the business recently and wanted to diversify his holdings through Swiss investments. His story was plausible and his documentation appeared legitimate. However, as our meeting progressed, I began noticing inconsistencies in his account. He claimed his business had been in textiles, but when I asked technical questions about the industry, his answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. More concerning was his unusual knowledge of banking procedures and international finance regulations. For someone who presented himself as a simple manufacturer, he understood complex financial instruments surprisingly well. What really set off alarm bells was when he asked specific questions about our client confidentiality policies and what information we might be required to share with international law enforcement agencies. These weren't typical concerns for legitimate business owners, and the way he asked suggested he already knew the answers. I decided to excuse myself to retrieve some additional documentation, which gave me a chance to do a quick background check on Mr. Kozlov using our internal systems. What I found made my stomach drop. There was an Interpol alert for an Anton Kozlov matching his description, wanted in connection with human trafficking operations across Eastern Europe. When I returned to the meeting room, Mr. Kozlov seemed to sense something had changed. His posture was different, more alert, and the frail elderly act had dropped slightly. He offered me tea from a service that had been brought in while I was away, insisting it was a special blend from his homeland and that refusing would be insulting. I felt trapped. If I refused the tea, it would confirm his suspicions that I had discovered something about his identity, but accepting it felt dangerous. I decided to take a small sip and then claim I needed to step out again to finalize some paperwork. However, within minutes of drinking the tea, I began feeling lightheaded and disoriented. That's when I realized the extent of the trap I was in. Mr. Kozlov's entire demeanor changed. He was no longer playing the role of the frail retiree. His voice became commanding, and his accent disappeared almost entirely. He calmly explained that he knew I had run a background check on him and that this created a problem for both of us. He revealed that he had been using Swiss banks for years to launder money from his trafficking operations, moving young women from Eastern Europe to Western countries where they were forced into prostitution. The banks provided a legitimate front for these transactions by disguising them as business investments and real estate purchases. What made this even more terrifying was his casual mention of other banking employees who had become complications over the years. He spoke about them the way someone might discuss minor business obstacles, completely devoid of humanity. He made it clear that I knew too much to simply walk away from our meeting. The drug in the tea was making it difficult for me to think clearly, but I realized he intended to either recruit me as a willing accomplice or eliminate me as a potential witness. He explained that the bank had security cameras in the hallways, but not in the individual meeting rooms, and that he had scheduled our appointment at a time when the building would be nearly empty. I tried to stay calm and think through my options. The electronic lock on the door meant I couldn't simply leave, and my phone wasn't getting a signal in the windowless room. Mr. Kozlov seemed to be waiting for the drug to take full effect before making his next move. Fortunately, the tea must not have been as strong as he intended, or maybe my body metabolized it differently than expected. While I was still dizzy and disoriented, I retained enough awareness to function. I pretended to be more affected than I actually was, slumping in my chair and letting my eyes unfocus. This seemed to satisfy him,
and he stepped away from the table to make a phone call in what sounded like Russian. I couldn't understand the words, but his tone suggested he was arranging for someone else to come to the bank. From context, it seemed like he was coordinating my removal from the building. While he was distracted with his call, I managed to activate the emergency alert on my phone, a feature our bank had installed for exactly these types of situations. It sent a silent alarm to both building security and local police, along with GPS coordinates. I also remembered that while the meeting rooms didn't have security cameras, they did have emergency communication systems connected to the security desk. There was a panic button hidden under the conference table that I was able to reach while pretending to be unconscious. The next few minutes felt like hours. Mr. Kozlov finished his phone call and returned his attention to me, checking my pulse and responsiveness. I had to remain completely limp while he handled me, which was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. He seemed satisfied that the drug was working and sat down to wait for his associates to arrive. Finally, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, but instead of the help Mr. Kozlov was expecting, it was Basel police and bank security. They had received both my emergency alert and the panic button signal. When they tried the door and found it electronically locked, they overrode the system and forced entry. Mr. Kozlov tried to maintain his elderly, confused act, claiming he was just a potential client who had gotten lost in the building. But the drug paraphernalia and electronic jamming devices they found in his briefcase told a different story. More damning was the phone call log that showed he had been coordinating with known associates of trafficking organizations. The investigation that followed revealed that Anton Kozlov was actually Dmitry Volkov, a major figure in Eastern Europe human trafficking networks. He had been using Swiss private banks for over a decade to launder millions of dollars in profits from his operations. The banks provided legitimacy to his money while asking minimal questions about their sources. Even more terrifying was the discovery that he had targeted me specifically. Through his network, he had learned that I was scheduled to handle new client consultations that week, and he had researched my background to determine if I might be corruptible or if I would need to be eliminated. During his trial, evidence emerged that linked him to the disappearances of at least 12 other banking employees across Europe who had become suspicious of his activities. Most of these people had simply vanished without a trace, but investigators found evidence suggesting they had been murdered to protect his operations. I left the banking industry immediately after testifying in his trial. The experience taught me that the world of private banking can attract the most dangerous criminals, people who view murder as just another business expense. I still have nightmares about those few minutes when I had to play unconscious while a human trafficker decided whether I would live or die based on my potential usefulness to his organization.